Part 2 is concerned with the phases of change management. The different phases of change management are firstly a preparation phase. During that phase, the intervention is determined, change management structures are set up, resources are allocated, support is generated, etc. Then the actual design needs to be managed. We discussed the different subphases involved in Module 2, like the current system analysis, problem analysis, brainstorming, setting up a design notebook. And then in Module 3, we discussed the actual ideal design. Module 4 dealt with implementation planning. So here we are going to discuss how to manage implementation planning. And then we also make some comments on managing the implementation phase and evaluation phase and the maintenance of the change phase. Before discussing each change management phase in more detail, let us look in overview what the outcome of each phase is, who the stakeholders are that are involved in the phase, and what some of the change support challenges of each phase are. The first phase is the preparation phase. The outcome is an appropriate and comprehensive intervention plan that shows us step by step how we are going to redesign the system, plan its implementation, and implement it. The stakeholders involved in that phase are the Change Management Board and the design team. The most important challenge of that phase is to create an awareness of the need for change amongst stakeholders so that they are providing the support for the change. The second phase is the redesign phase, which also includes various design iterations. The outcome of that phase is an ideal design of the system. The stakeholders involved are the design team, the members of the system that is being redesigned, as well as other external stakeholders. The challenge of this phase is to come up with a design that meets the stakeholder expectations and that aligns the stakeholders so that the stakeholders support the design. The third phase is implementation planning, and the outcome is an implementable plan. It involves the design team, specialized task teams, the members of the system, and possibly other stakeholders who are involved in having to implement parts of the plan. The challenge is to work within available and procurable resources, and then to generate an agreement of the stakeholders to implement. In other words, to expand those resources in order to implement their share of the design. The fourth phase is the implementation phase, and the outcome of that is the actual implementation of the change according to the plan. The stakeholders involved are the change facilitators and the relevant planning forums that are involved in the change. The challenge of this phase is to actually enable the members of the planning forums to change so that they have enough knowledge and also are motivated and have the necessary resources to do the change. The fifth phase is the evaluation phase. The outcome is the measurement according to previously designed criteria and evaluation mechanisms and procedures that have been set up for that purpose. The stakeholders involved are the change facilitators and then the relevant planning forums whose change is being evaluated. The support challenge of this phase is the willingness to learn from the implementation phase and the outcomes that were achieved, and if outcomes were not achieved as intended, to be willing to iterate back to a previous phase to change the plan and then implement again. The sixth phase is that of maintaining the change. The outcome is that the change becomes entrenched in the system and actually becomes the momentum of the system. The stakeholders involved here are the relevant planning forums who are maintaining their performance according to the change. The support challenge here is to reinforce the change, to make it part of the daily routine, and also to learn in an ongoing way and to entrench that learning in the knowledge repositories. Let us look more closely at the preparation phase. First, we need to set up change management structures. This includes, first of all, the Biomatrix Program Management Board. The responsibilities of that board are that it provides overall governance and strategic direction in line with the overarching strategic requirements and needs of the organization. This includes managing delivery of the program, also the coordination of the various phases of the change and their outcome, and being responsible for the timing of the phases, how fast the organization wants to complete these phases. Then the board generates support for the program that includes making sure that there's stakeholder participation and also that there is commitment of top management and that this commitment is seen by the various stakeholders of the change. Then the board ensures the quality and relevance of the outcome, and it appoints design and task teams. The members of the board include a learning manager, a design manager, change manager, and biomatrix consultant. The learning manager should be the head of the corporate academy or head of training and development. The reason why we need a learning manager is that the biomatrix development programs are education-driven. The knowledge is transferred in the education phase and inputs to the design are generated by the learners, and the actual designs are done by teams of learners during the team learning phase. It is the responsibility of the learning manager to manage that education program and to provide all necessary learning support. The design manager should be the head of organization development. The responsibility is to ensure that the designs are relevant for the organization and that the implementation plans are feasible in terms of the availability of the resources within the organization. The change manager should be a senior manager, ideally a member of the top management board of the organization. This manager is responsible for keeping contact to top management and getting their support and promoting the project to them. And that manager needs to get the various mandates for continuing the programs at different intervals. The responsibility of the biomatrix consultant is the delivery of the program according to biomatrix standards and design, and the consultant provides ongoing program support. Let us look more closely at it is important that there is enough support generated for the change. This includes typically the allocation of adequate resources, first of all human resources, that the right persons are allocated to participate in the change, that they get enough time to participate. There also needs to be financial resources allocated, and there needs to be ongoing support by top management. A diagnosis. We need to establish what kind of change we're dealing with, what needs to change, why, what is the scope of the change, and also what is the stage of the development of the system so that we can look at appropriate interventions. Then, based on the diagnosis, we are designing an intervention that involves selecting the appropriate design framework. In Module 2, we discuss various frameworks that we are using in biometric system theory. The first is the issue redesign framework. The theoretical base for issue redesign is that every issue is co-produced by different cofactors arising from the outer and inner environment and the self, and that different stakeholders are associated with those issues, and the co-production of an issue or a system. We have also learned that systems and issues are multidimensional. They have an economic, political, cultural, technological, and so on dimension. And in Module 3, we have learned that every system is co-produced by 7 forces of organization, the ethos, aims, process, structure, and so on. So we can apply these different forces, perspectives, cofactors to identify the specifics of an issue or a system. And we can even go into a second round where we are looking in more detail at each of the cofactors in the first round. Where do we apply issue redesign? It is a very useful framework for a quick exploration of any issue or design situation. For example, in the implementation phase, one can create a good, quick overview if we're asking who are the stakeholders, what are the dimensions, and so on. So we can explore the issue from different perspectives. It is also useful for a more detailed exploration of, in inverted commas, smaller issues. By this I mean our customer complaint, which we are discussing now in our team meeting. For those kind of issues, it's very useful to quickly put the issue in the middle and say who are the stakeholders, what are the dimensions of the issues, what are the cofactors, whatever is appropriate in that particular situation. Another framework is that of activity system redesign. The theoretical basis of that is the 7 forces of system organization, and we apply those to the redesign of an activity system. This is what Module 3 of the Biometrics Management Education Program was about. Where is that framework applied? First of all, for project design, for functional redesign. We can use it for business process redesign, for the redesign of supply and value chains, and also for industry problem dissolving if we use the supply chain as the basis for identifying problems and resolving them. Another framework is that of entity system redesign. Again, we apply the 7 forces of system organization to an entity system, because the generic structure of an entity system is a 3-dimensional matrix. We apply the 7 forces to that matrix. Where is the particular framework applied? For organizational redesign and for organization transformation and development. It is also a useful framework if we want to redesign public-private sector partnerships and transform those, or for the cooperation between, for example, NGOs and government departments, etc. The Biometrics Organization Transformation Program is based on this particular framework and applies it in depth to the transformation of the client organization. Then we have also introduced the multi-level, multi-dimensional web as a framework. The theoretical foundation of that framework is that systems are organized hierarchically from a planet to the atomic level via societal, individual levels and so on. And that systems at each level are multidimensional. So we are plotting the levels against the dimensions, creating a matrix. Where do we use that particular framework? It is used in public policy redesign, for example, the redesign of an education system or a transport system. It is useful in the context of societal problem dissolving, for example, dissolving the finance crisis or unemployment or poverty. And then it is also useful as a framework for contextualizing public debates. In my speech to the World Future Society South Africa chapter, I gave a case study of this, and it is available on our webpage. In the Biometric Societal Transformation Program, this framework is applied extensively. Then we need to create awareness amongst stakeholders. Sometimes one area of a business or an organization is aware that it needs to be changed, and that change would affect other stakeholders who may not be aware that change is necessary. So in the preparation phase, an awareness needs to be created. Maybe the CEO needs to address the organization or the governor in the public domain and explain the change, why is it needed, what will be done, what the scope is, to generate participation, buy-in, understanding from the outset. And then the participants in the design process need to be selected. Typically, an intervention is designed by some members of the system, but not all members of the system. And if it is a complex intervention, they may have to be prepared for the intervention before they're actually participating. We look now at phase 2, the redesign phase. This phase involves facilitating the ideal redesign of the system and also facilitating the design iterations until we get to a final design. We have discussed the various steps of making an ideal design in module 2 on problem solving and dissolving, and we're going to briefly repeat the various steps here and add some facilitation notes. Step 1 is identifying the problems in the current system. Step 2 is brainstorming ideas for an ideal design. The design notebook phase organizes those brainstormed ideas, and then the ideal design phase is using those ideas to actually create an ideal design for the system. The various tools and methods we have discussed in module 2 included identifying problems, identifying problem cofactors. We also talked about identifying the biggest failure experiences in the past associated with the issue, and to look at the failure cofactors. Who should do that exercise? Well, ideally, all the stakeholders that are going to be impacted on or involved in the change, at least the participants in the design workshop. How can we facilitate that exercise? We can have workshops and identify the problems and problem cofactors in a workshop. Typically, when I do that, I allow people as individuals to write down a list of problems and cofactors, and those we cluster according to related themes on the wall for further processing in the brainstorming phase. One can also identify the problems and cofactors before the brainstorming workshop, and one can do that by means of questionnaires or interviews or even online. It is important for the facilitator to know that there is no fundamental difference between what is a problem and what is a problem cofactor, because problem cofactors are problems in other contexts co-produced by a problem from another situation. We use the distinction merely to allow people to understand the systemic nature of the problem and also to surface as many problems stroke problem cofactors as possible. The reason why it is important to have quantity is, first of all, the more problems a system has got, the more potential it has for development. And the problems act as a foundation for jump-starting creativity. Usually we do that by the frog's prince method, the problem being the frog, which we convert into an ideal prince. It is useful to use multidimensionality to add to the existing list of problems and cofactors. Very often I allow first people in free flow to identify problems and cofactors, and then I ask them, do you know additional cofactors that you have not thought of before in the economic, cultural, political, technological, etc. dimension? And then typically more problems and problem cofactors are forthcoming. What is important in surfacing problems and cofactors is that they must be understandable. The facilitator must again and again remind the delegates to not write keywords, to write whatever they write in such a way that anybody who has not been part of the workshop can understand what is being meant. No keywords. There should at least be half sentences or whole sentences. We have also previously heard that the logic of the problem is not the logic of the solution. In the case of a problem dissolving or ideal design situation. For that reason, it is purposeless to discuss problems because they represent the problem logic and do not really assist us in identifying the solution logic. So I normally do not allow discussion of a problem, but merely the surfacing of the problem. Likewise, a blaming should not be allowed. Once a system has a problem, doesn't matter what part of the system has the problem, if one part has a problem, the whole has a problem. It is also useful at the end of this phase to distinguish between problem solving and dissolving and to pick out any problem cofactors that can be solved without having to redesign the system. And those will then give the quick wins that one is always looking for in a change intervention. One important tool that we have not mentioned before is exploration of the past. This can be very useful in the context of organizational culture. It is also useful in the public sector to create mutual understanding in conflict situations. An example was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, which explored the past under apartheid. What a facilitator needs to remember about exploring the past is that different stakeholders remember the past differently and remember different parts of the past. So one needs a lot of contributions to start approximating the truth. It is also well known that in witness situations, witnesses are very unreliable, also as a result of seeing different things. We also know from brain research that once memory has been verbalized, surfaced, verbalized, and stored again, it is already distorted because it has been filtered through current experience. As a result of all that, the facilitator must realize that the purpose of exploring the past is not to establish truth, but to share experience, to create mutual understanding, and if it is associated with a hurtful situation, to contribute to healing. We can see from our figure that as the current situation unfolds in the future, it creates a fan of current futures. As we look back in the past, we can see a fan of perceived pasts. Another method we have referred to previously and illustrated previously is systems dynamics. If we make a systems dynamics model in the context of problem solving, then we require an expert team to do so, because the systems dynamics model represents the actual functioning, the ethos, the conceptual reality of the system. And problem solving wants to restore the system to that particular design using the current logic underlying the system. So the model must be as comprehensive as possible. By comparison, if we deal with a systems dynamics situation in the context of problem dissolving, so if we want to make an ideal redesign of the system, then the systems dynamics of the current merely reflects the current system. It models the problem situation, and it will not help us to arrive at a solution. It can, however, be very useful if the stakeholders participate in drawing up a systems dynamics model, because they will understand the problem nature of the situation. They can walk through the change in the model and realize how complex moving and shifting the problem actually is. They will then most likely get motivated to participate in an ideal design situation. And there's no need to have a comprehensive model. It is enough if one understands the systemic nature. And it is also a useful communication tool to communicate the need for change and the complexity of change to other stakeholders. Then we have spoken about the current future analysis, trend analysis, and scenarios. Again, in a problem-solving situation, the scenarios are alternative options of how the system actually will be once we restore its functioning. And the scenarios can help us to design the interventions, maybe remove blockages or faults somewhere in the system. For that reason, the scenarios should be comprehensive. By comparison, if we deal with a problem-dissolving situation, then the purpose of the scenarios, again, like with the systems dynamics model, is to show alternative possible outcomes of the problem situation, most of them being undesirable if the problem is really serious. The brainstorming part of ideal redesign was also discussed in Module 2. We extensively used the problem-based brainstorming method, the so-called boiling frog into princess method. This method gives rise to creativity and also a new logic. And as I said earlier, the more problems we have, the more ideas for a solution will we get. The facilitator must follow the generic brainstorming rules. Don't judge, don't pre-select, quality is less important than quantity. The facilitator must also reinforce throughout the exercise that a prince is by definition unattainable, or at best attainable in a moment, and as soon as it's attained, like a shifting goalpost, the ideal moves on. By comparison, the strategies must be practical and doable with the existing resources of the system. So to have a strategy that we should treble our staff if we do not have the funds to do so is not an acceptable strategy. It is also useful to use multidimensionality to develop more strategies. We should also break down strategies into sub-strategies if they are too high level, too far removed from doing. After each frog prince transformation, one should test for comprehensiveness and completeness. What I mean by that is, if we ask, will that prince and those strategies, if implemented, dissolve the problem? If the answer is yes, we can go to the next point for brainstorming. If the answer is no, do we need more strategies, or maybe even need more princes and strategies for each of the new princes? We have previously warned about the danger of negative princes. The danger has two reasons. The one being that the logic of the problem is not the logic of the solution. So to say, I don't want to be sick, is part of the problem logic, namely that of sickness. The second reason is that the subconscious, the brain mind, does not understand the word no and reaffirms actually the problem, the disease. Similarly, we warned about relationship frogs. If we have a problem between the staff and the boss, or the wife and the husband, the ideal prince is not to have a new boss or to have a new husband, but first of all, to change the interaction between the two parties. We have also explored so-called arational methods or non-rational methods, like drawing the problem or drawing the ideal. I also sometimes let groups dance it or role play it or story tell it. These methods are useful because they give rise to creativity and possibly a new logic. They're also a lot of fun and bring lightheartedness into the situation. However, one has to consider here different thinking styles, in the sense that not everyone is equally good at making a drawing or a dance or a role play. Similar to the different past exercise, we can do an ideal past exercise. That can be a very powerful exercise. It says, what should we have done ideally instead of what we actually did? And it gives emotional satisfaction. It also creates mutual understanding of what should have been and could have been, and allows healing. To design the ideal past is also a foundation for determining compensation for past hurts. So if we're looking at the drawing, we see a mirroring of the current future and the perceived pasts. Like the current situation moves into different current futures, so if we look back at the past, we can perceive different types of pasts. And the ideal future mirrors. It can inform not only what the difference between the ideal past and perceived past is and where compensation should occur, but we can get an idea from the ideal past about how an ideal future could look like, or what strategies we should employ to create an ideal future. We also have discussed success-based brainstorming. One of the most useful exercises is to identify the biggest success experiences in the past and cofactors that contributed to it. And the purpose of that is to multiply what works in the current system. The facilitator needs to be, however, aware that the success-based brainstorming is current future and current logic based. It is not a transformation of the logic. Nevertheless, it helps us to expand what works currently so that we are not throwing out the baby with the bathwater when we are redesigning our system. So this represents the baby which we want to keep. There's another success-based brainstorming associated with best practice in the industry or benchmarking. This is typically identified by a task team. It also reflects current system logic and would expand what works already if applied in a system. It does not lead the system to the next stage of transformation and next stage of competitive advantage. After we have completed the brainstorming phase, a lot of data, of course, are produced. These need to be organized in preparation for a design and also recorded and referenced. This is done in a design notebook. What the task team has to do is to recategorize the information according to the design framework. So they take the different brainstormed ideas and cluster them under relevant headings of the design team. What they need to be careful about is to eliminate duplication, but in such a way that they are not losing detail through abstraction. Also, they should not judge and eliminate apparently unsuitable ideas. Such ideas sometimes spark very good ideas during the design phase. They should integrate related ideas. So if, for example, 10 related ideas about performance management were submitted, then 1 or 2 ideas are made out of the 10 that contain all 10. Sometimes an idea fits into more than one category and should be clustered under different categories, and this may involve some reformulation if necessary. If they encounter suitcase ideas, those are ideas that have many different types of ideas packed under one particular idea, then they should unpack the suitcase and categorize the different parts under different headings. We also find it useful to have the original workshop output reproduced in an appendix for the sake of transparency, that everyone can go back and look that their idea was actually considered. A second form of recategorization involves categorizing according to the change owner. What we mean by that is the system or subsystem or person that can actually do something about the change. For example, if I'm an HR manager, one of my core problems may be something that doesn't work for me from the IT system. So as I formulate strategies and maybe even ideas on how to dissolve that issue, I cannot do something about that as the HR manager. Only IT can do something about it. So the IT issue gets clustered under IT. So all IT problems from all over the organization will be presented to the IT department or under that heading. What the task team must be careful about here is that in eliminating any duplications, they don't eliminate the differences from the originating system. What I mean is, I in HR may have a different interpretation of the kind of data processing that I propose to them than manufacturing may have. And these subtleties should be maintained. It is also useful that the task team incorporates new information based on generic systems principles, like those which we learned about in Module 3. So, for example, that they add ideas on systemic governance that did not come out of the workshops. We feel, however, that those ideas should be marked to distinguish them from the stakeholder information. In summary, the principles of systemic organizational development are the following. In the case of the environment, we must ensure that the system understands the environment, adapts to it, and can also co-create it together with its stakeholders. It should clarify its ethos, entrench self-referral so that the system can live its ethos, and it must be able to manage congruence of ethos with its environment and its stakeholders, and be able to mediate in conflict situation where there is ethos incongruence. Then the aims of the system should be cascaded in space and time, cascaded in space from the containing system, and it should cascade it into its subsystems, and it should cascade its aim in time from the long term to the operational plan and the immediate action. The process is concerned with efficient processing, continuity of MEI flow of both products and byproducts and the tapping thereof, as well as value adding. Structural considerations of the design include an optimal configuration of the acting and support substance within an activity system, and the threefold organization of an entity system. The governance considerations of a design should ensure that the aims of the activity system can be achieved and that there is coordination throughout an entity system. There should also be ongoing performance management and ongoing organizational learning. The MEI considerations of the design should be appropriate selection and continued development of the process structure and governance resources of the system. We are now looking at ideal redesign in more detail. This consists of firstly doing an ideal design, the first draft, and then iterating through design phases involving more and more stakeholders. How do we formulate an ideal design? An ideal design should describe the system in ideal terms. As we have said in previous modules, the term ideal means that it cannot be achieved. It is timeless. It is universally relevant. Although it cannot be achieved, it can nevertheless be approximated. It should also be formulated as if it already exists as an outcome. So we are not formulating it would be nice to have or the design should be like this, but we say the design is like this. One can formulate the ideal design in different ways. There is no right or wrong. It is ultimately a unique expression of the system about itself or about the sponsor of the system. And it can also depend on context. In some cultures or in some scientific disciplines, there are different ways of expressing a particular concept. This, of course, needs to be considered when formulating a design. Ideally, one expresses the design in a high-level visionary statement, which would nevertheless be abstracted from a more detailed exploration in terms of the seven forces. Whenever we talk about design iteration and higher level abstraction, that is what we mean, to create higher level information that is ideally visionary. For example, at the time of recording, Germany has announced its change in energy policy and there are widespread discussions in the country. There are various ways one could express the ideal design of what the new energy scene should look like. My personal expression would be free and clean energy is available where it is needed, when it is needed. Of course, it is an ideal that can never be achieved, but we can approximate it. It can be more and more widely available. It can be cheaper and cheaper. It can be cleaner and cleaner. So we can approximate that high-level visionary statement. At the same time, if one makes a statement like that, it should be able to be cascaded into increasing detail in terms of the 7 forces, what the ethos should be, what the aims should be, what the processes should be, and so on. And also the subsystems, the different types of energy generation, energy transportation, energy usage, etc. And also the context of application. In different regions of the country, there will be different aspects of the design operative or more relevant than in other regions. So one needs great detail as well as high-level abstraction and a continuous information flow across. What constitutes an ideal design of an entity system like an organization? The threefold organization of entity systems gives rise to a threefold design. The highest visionary expression of that is typically in the mission statement. A mission statement expresses what the system wants to do for the stakeholders in its external environment, internal environment, and for itself. In the context of an organization, this means what does the organization want to do for its customers, namely what is the nature of its business, its products, services, markets, etc., and what does it want to be as a result of it. This involves an ideal business redesign, and this redesign should be done in terms of the 7 forces of system organization. What the organization wants to do for itself and what it wants to be as a result is the subject of an ideal organizational redesign. For example, the redesign into a learning organization. These too should be done in terms of the 7 forces of organization. What the organization wants to do for its inner stakeholders and what it wants to be as a result of it involves an ideal resource redesign, ideally also done in terms of the 7 forces. The actual organizational design emerges from the interaction and higher level abstraction of those 3 sub-designs. There must be coherence between these 3 sub-designs. For example, we should not advocate high-tech business and information age business and run an organization with industrial age structures and supports. We must also look at the balance between those 3 sub-designs. We should not emphasize, for example, business development at the expense of organization development or resource development, or vice versa. Creating an ideal design involves the incorporation of the brainstormed information in a design framework under consideration of systemic design principles. In other words, a design team is working through the information in the notebook and will lift out some thoughts to make them ideals and consider which would be appropriate strategies and so on. So while the design is guided by a clear framework and there are clear principles, the way these are applied to the brainstormed information is really a creative act. So the design team needs to be creative. It is important that the ideal design incorporates the different, even diverse and divergent expectations of stakeholders and their multiple perspectives. and the design must do so in a win-win manner. In other words, it must represent a higher order logic. The governance design must adhere to systemic governance principles. We need to consider the different types of governance, form-creating, form-changing, form-destroying governance, and that we don't build the wrong type of governance into our design. We need the right mix between self-governance and external governance, and we need to have feed-forward and feedback mechanisms built into our governance that ensure performance management, the achievement of the intended aims, and also ongoing learning and development in the system. Then we should build multifunctionality in the design, and multifunctionality consists of 3 types. The first is we have one strategy or one course of action with which we can achieve 3 different types of ends. For example, we can go out to eat in order to nourish our body, do some business, have some fun. Or we could take one outcome, one end, and there are different activities which we could use to achieve that end. So if entertainment is our aim, we could go and dine, we could do some conversation, I could read a book. They all serve the achievement of that one end. The third type of multifunctionality is that 2 activities use one structure. We have one conference center and we have 2 conferences going on. Or an organization has a word processing pool which every function can use. The questions that lead us to multifunctionality are which other outcome or end can be achieved with this particular means or strategy. The second question is which other mean or strategy can be used to achieve this particular end. Question 3 is which other end or outcome can this particular structure serve. I would like to give a personal case study of how a multifunctional design could look like. When I used to work for the Institute for Futures Research at Stellenbosch University, we, the staff, felt that we were very overworked because we had a lot of seemingly diverse projects that we had to complete. First, we had to do research reports for our business associates who paid us. Because we worked in a university, the university expected us, even if they didn't pay us for it, that we publish regularly scientific articles. Then it expected us to teach at the MBA programs, and the various conferences in the country asked us to give papers on the future of whatever the conference was about. So one day when we were sitting over tea, again complaining about how much we had to do, when one of us remembered that we should actually practice what we preach and should apply some multifunctional thinking to our situation. So we had another cup of tea and an hour of brainstorm, and we came up with the following, which we afterwards implemented. Our associates are most important for ensuring our future, so we will supply them with research reports as in the past. If we are doing the research reports in a more academic way and adding more literature search and peer controls and peer meetings and so on to the procedure and reformulating some parts of it, we could convert the research project into a scientific article for publishing. If we do a series of PowerPoint slides on each project as we do it, we can file those and build up a library for teaching and conference purposes. And if a conference comes and wants us to talk about something specific, we offer them the range of topics we have, and if they want something completely different, we decline. So with that 1 hour of brainstorming, we have literally reduced our workload by almost 3/4. I have learned from that particular example and have in my own life, personal and work life, applied multifunctionality continuously. And the biomatrix management education and transformation programs are also multifunctional programs. In the transformation program, we provide education, and the education is set up in such a way that mind shift change is occurring, organizational transformation will be achieved through designing the change interventions in the name of education that will, if implemented, lead to an organization transformation. And the program also interfaces with stakeholders at various sections, contributing to a change in organizational culture in preparation for a transformation. So the design of the program is a multifunctional one. Typically, multifunctionality is what we talk in system thinking about doing more, achieving more by doing less. And this can be achieved when the design team looks at all the information that has been brainstormed and plays around with these 3 questions in the context of the different brainstormed information that they have accumulated. Once the first draft of a design is made by a design team, then we need to have a widening group of stakeholders participate in the design process. We need to enroll them and we need to engage them in the design through design iterations. This can involve the creation of sub-designs for each subsystem, as well as having iteration through the overarching design by means of workshops, maybe online discussions, public debates in the media. If we are dealing with a public sector issue, we can issue questionnaires, do Delphi studies and the like. So alternative design options, alternative strategies, alternative ideals and a formulation of ideals can be explored in that way. Design is an iterative process per se, even in the first iteration, but with further iterations one will find that it gets refined, it gets changed, and most importantly, mindsets are being aligned around the overarching vision of the whole system that is being redesigned, be it an activity, entity, or web system, or an issue. In facilitating the stakeholders, facilitators should consider that a particular type of stakeholder has a particular interest in the system, and it would be useful to engage them in refining that design. So in creating sub-designs, they should work with coherent stakeholder groups. To create an overarching design, it is better to work with multiple stakeholders so that diverse interests of different stakeholders can be discussed in those particular forums. One very important function of the facilitators is that they must see that the overarching design and the sub-designs hang together, that they are not contradictory or overlapping, that they are function specific on the one hand and also integrative within one larger whole on the other. The following case study is a good example of the effectiveness of design iterations and also the power of design iterations. This happened in the early 1970s when Paris needed an urban renewal strategy, and the political climate at the time was so that the left and the right in the Cold War climate could not agree on particular strategies. So system thinkers were called in. Osbekan, Garchadaki, who told me the story, and Eckhoff, I believe, were involved in the exercise. What they did is they set up a design team. It apparently consisted of something like 7 persons who decided to make an ideal design for Paris. Whom did the 7 represent? Nobody, themselves. They were just creative individuals. They did, however, consider various stakeholders of the design and what these stakeholders might want to have happen in Paris, or how Paris should look. And they finished the design and went afterwards from stakeholder to get their specific input. So they would, for example, go to the first stakeholder, for argument's sake, the Chamber of Industries, and ask them, what do you think about the design? Chamber of Industries would look at the design from the perspective of industries, not from the perspective of art or road building. So they may say, we like this, we don't like that, what about this, and make other proposals. And the design team would co-design with each stakeholder their inputs, their concerns that they hadn't considered. And the purpose of the design team is not to push their ideas, but to get the input, to enroll stakeholders, and to make sure that the whole design stays coherent. The Chamber of Industries wouldn't say we want the steelworks in Fontainebleau when other groups said we want a green Paris. So the importance of the design team is managing the coherence of the design and enrolling. And as the process continued, each stakeholder had their own circle of discussions around the design and widened, so different industries within the Chamber of Industries or within the Arts Council. It may be the visual arts and the theaters and the architect, etc., who would look more specifically at the design from their perspective, from their functional perspective, because stakeholders are a functional concept. I believe even the various suburbs and regions of Paris had their own circles of discussion. So overall, the process continued for close to 3 years, and millions of inputs were received. The discussion went via public media, via Delphi studies, questionnaires, workshops, etc. In hindsight, the importance was not so much the original design. Probably if 7 other persons had sat around a table and made a design, Paris would look different today. The importance was the process, that for a couple of years, the populace of Paris engaged in the question, how do we want our Paris to look, and throw ideas around and discuss. And that is the power of enrollment strategy, which involves a co-design after a basic design has been made. Now, what is the difference between a lobby and a co-design as Paris illustrates? Because the processes are similar. The difference is that a lobby pushes its own point of view and wants to convince others to go along with them, while the enrollment strategy does not push its own opinions. The design team, they're genuinely interested in co-designing with the stakeholders. It is a very powerful methodology that can also be used by organizations. I have used it in-house to align different business units who didn't want to cooperate initially. We involved representatives in co-design, and when some of the business units who didn't want to participate disagreed, we went and did a little Paris, as we called it. I have done a similar exercise, facilitated one in education with various education policy makers. So it is a very powerful technique that one can use, and relatively unimportant members of a system and relatively few people can have an enormous influence if they're using that methodology. Phase 3 is concerned with implementation planning. Once an ideal design has been finalized, implementation planning can start. One cannot implement a design unless one has made a detailed implementation plan. In Module 4, we have talked extensively about implementation planning. In summary, this involves backcasting. In other words, we need to determine the implementation strategies which lead us to implement the design. We have also said that these strategies could be quite elaborate projects which would need an ideal design in themselves. Once we have decided on the different implementation strategies, we can cascade them in space into sub-strategies and also in time from longer term to shorter term. We have also said from a facilitation perspective, to make a design of alternative strategies and sub-strategies could be iterative in nature. Sometimes we start with broad strategies, sometimes we make design at a sub-strategy and iterate back into their overarching strategies. This differs from case to case and from application to application. So the facilitator needs to exert judgment here. We have illustrated implementation planning with this figure. Namely, once we've got the ideal design, we determine the different implementation strategies and through cascading into sub-strategies and down into action plans, we will end up with longer, maybe medium-term, annual strategic plans and an immediate operational plan. We have also learned in Module 4 that we need to determine the resource requirements, what human, financial, material resources are required for each of the strategies collectively and each of the sub-strategies, what the time requirements are for the various sub-strategies and how we can sequencing them, and who is responsible for planning implementation and then actually implementing each of the sub-strategies. Typically in larger systems, this can involve different organizations. We have also learned in Module 4 that some of the most important change management considerations are that the implementation plan is feasible in terms of resource and time availability. If the resources and time do not support the ideal design, it could imply that we have to do a design iteration and then afterwards have a different implementation plan. The larger the system, the more partial iterations are likely. Not the overall, but between different parts of the system. If we have to change the overall design completely, then we haven't done a good design job a priori. We haven't considered all the problems of all the stakeholders and transformed them appropriately. If you're dealing with new systems that are being established, then very often implementation strategies end with the start of the new system or the beginning of the new system. In the context of an existing system, when we plan the change of that system, the implementation plan is integrated with the current strategic plan of the system and is implemented in the day-to-day operations of that system. Other change management considerations are that typically the implementation planning is not done by the design team, but that there are sub-teams that are concerned with planning the implementation in detail. However, it is important that the implementation team understands the design, the reason for the design and the spirit of the design, as well as the detail, in order to be able to do a proper implementation plan. This is especially important since we know a design is an ideal that can never be quite achieved, but it needs to be approximated. So the implementation team is concerned with the degree of approximation of the ideal design. One important consideration here is that the members of the implementation team have actually been involved in some design iterations and are really familiar with that. As mentioned before, the larger the system is, the more iterations between parts of the design and parts of an implementation plan could be involved. And the longer the process would take. For example, in the case study Paris, we have seen that the design iteration took 2 years. There was not really an implementation plan per se, but different functions of Paris interpreted the design and changed their functioning accordingly. Nevertheless, it's important to have continuity and coordination between design and implementation. In a situation like Paris, this is less important, like in a situation of an organization. In the organization, the planned change interventions need to be coherently implemented. And that is useful if the design team and the various implementation teams are cooperating and that there's a coordination between them. In the public domain, industry transformation, for example, or public policy design implementation takes longer. It can be useful to establish a dedicated organization, as for example an NGO, to facilitate that transformation in an ongoing manner. For example, if we want to transform our energy situation towards renewable energy, this is an ongoing process over many years, and every new technology development could change parts of the design or parts of the implementation, and it could be useful to have an industry body dedicated solely to this. Ideally, of course, it is a function of government to do that, but there's not always, especially with changing governments, a continuity which really looks impartially at changes in the industry or policy. Phase 4 is concerned with implementation. Once the implementation plans have been approved, the system will start to implement according to the operational plan within the performance management cycle. Namely, what has been planned will be implemented, there will be evaluation and, if necessary, replanning. The evaluation and replanning we will be discussing in the next point. What are some of the facilitation considerations of this phase? First, until the new design is actually implemented through the action steps, it is business as usual. I'm always very surprised as a management consultant how, when one starts discussing the future and planning an ideal future, how people put everything they're doing on hold until the new has become clear. This is not systemic. The systemic way of doing things is carrying on with business as usual until we automatically, through the performance management cycle, start doing our new action steps. Once the implementation plan has been approved, responsibility is transferred to the system to start implementing, and it will do so in a step-by-step manner following its previously designed operational plan, and in doing so will slowly move towards its ideal future. In large interventions, it is useful if the implementation is piloted in part of the system first, so that any difficulties can be ironed out, and also experience gained which may be used in creating a help desk or creating support structures for helping the large numbers to go through the implementation phase. Until the responsibility to start implementing has been placed onto a system, it should carry on doing what it was doing previously. The implementation should flow very smoothly out of a changed plan, a changed operational, annual and long-term strategic plan that is being followed. Once implementation of a change intervention has started, we need to monitor progress and evaluate it. So the evaluation phase will start. It consists of evaluation criteria as well as evaluation and change mechanisms and procedures. The evaluation criteria will have been part of the ideal design, the governance part of it, and will relate to meeting objectives, performance criteria, that means how the system achieves its objectives. Then they will relate to meeting time requirements and budgets, and also return on investment if this was part of the design. These criteria need to be cascaded through all levels of the system, and if necessary, reinterpreted at those different levels. The evaluation and change mechanisms and procedures are part of the overall governance of the organization. More specifically, they are part of the ongoing strategic performance management in the organization, which involves the plan, implement, evaluate, replan or maintain cycle. To establish the evaluation phase, we need to plan evaluation criteria, evaluation mechanisms, and then evaluation procedures. The evaluation mechanisms refer to the structure we are creating, and then the procedures are the activities that we are actually enlivening those structures. Some of the facilitation considerations are that we need overarching performance criteria and cascade those throughout the system. At different parts of the system, they will be interpreted as is appropriate to that particular level in the system. We also need to establish an evaluation mechanism and a prescribed procedure that is universal for the organization as a whole. In the context of a project, it could be a project closure mechanism and procedure. And in the context of ongoing management, it would be performance management and also knowledge management. And we need to ensure that those procedures are entrenched and practiced in all parts of the organization. In other words, by every planning forum. Phase 6 is concerned with maintaining the change and also with the ongoing development of the system. The change is entrenched by making it part of the strategic and operational plans of the planning forum that is concerned with the change. And it is maintained through the ongoing planning and performance management cycle of that particular planning forum. Ongoing development occurs if the performance management cycle is conducted in a learning manner, and if the learning is recorded in knowledge repositories and is actually used as a reference and input to further planning and future decision making. To maintain change, it must be entrenched, it must become the norm, and this is typically reinforced through the performance management cycle. Some of the facilitation considerations are that the new performance should be supported by clear guidelines for best practice, and that those are recorded in knowledge repositories so that they are really becoming the guidelines for the system's behavior, and that new behavior must be reinforced by new reward and sanction systems. If the old reward and sanction system is maintained, then there is a danger that the system flips back into the old behavior that was rewarded previously. This figure illustrates the change management process that we have been discussing in part 3. It shows the different phases of the change management process. Those are the orange boxes. It also shows the roles involved in the change management process, illustrated by the gray boxes. The arrows show how they interface with each other. Once top management has decided that a change intervention is necessary and knows the scope and purpose of it, it will appoint a change management board consisting of the change sponsor, who will mediate between the change intervention and the board. It will also consist of the head of the design team and the change support team. The board will appoint a design and change support team. Once these teams have been appointed, they will start the preparation of the intervention and then facilitate the design, the problem analysis, the brainstorming, design notebook and design phases. Once the design has been reasonably complete, design iterations will start, which involve a widening of stakeholder involvement. These iterations could feed back on changes in the design. Once the design has been approved, it will move to the implementation planning phase. This is facilitated by task teams who work in cooperation with the change support and the design team. The task teams also facilitate the cascading of implementation planning into the strategic plans and the operational plans. The design will be implemented through the action steps that are determined on the basis of the operational plan. Their implementation will be evaluated, and if necessary, there will be a change in the plan. Otherwise, the action step will be maintained. If evaluation shows that the plans cannot be implemented, there may be a change in the strategic plan or even implementation plan. The stakeholders are involved throughout the phases of the change management process, either through consideration or direct involvement. This change management process will also be followed in restructuring the organization in the context of the Biometrics Organization Transformation Program. This program will establish the planning forums or reorganized planning forums which are implementing the various change interventions that are necessary in order to become a systemic learning organization.